Yes, we're going to start with a short introduction of the subject and of Adam. The Prime Minister in Hungary, which is still a member of the European Union, Viktor Orban, recently attacked what he called, quotation marks, mixing of races. In a couple of weeks, Italy, also a EU country, might have a prime minister from a party, Fratelli d'Italia, which is a direct heir to the Mussolini fascist party. And after the upcoming Swedish elections, a party founded by right-wing extremists, some of them neo-Nazis, could emerge as kingmaker. And after the American presidential election 2024, Trump might once again move into the White House, if not literally, so at least politically, in the shape of a Trumpist Republican clone. That would be very good news for Vladimir Putin and his ongoing all-out war, not only on Ukraine and its population, but also on Western values, liberal democracy, and a world order based on the principle of rule of law. So the future for liberalism in the broad sense of the word, the broader sense of the word, certainly looks bleak or rather black. Nevertheless, there is a surprisingly optimistic keynote in Adam Gopnik's book about the state and nature of liberalism in the word's broader sense. 1,000 Small Sanities, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism, which is translated into Swedish by Fri Tanke as 1000 små framsteg, liberalismen ett moraliskt äventyr, was written as a reaction to the Trump triumph 2020, which doesn't make the optimism less puzzling. But on the other hand, strong men and ideologies who promises to make this or that great again most often fails, almost always fails, whereas liberalism, and that may be the main theme of Adam's book, has succeeded in making the world less cruel, more human, with the help not of one great leap, but step by step, penetrating the walls of ignorance and evil like drops of water, slowly, just by 1,000 small sanities. That said, I would like to present Adam. He's in the United States a very well-known writer and author and journalist. He was born in Philadelphia, grew up in Montreal in an academic, secular Jewish family. He has been beloved and admired staff writer for the magazine New Yorker since the 80s. He has written numerous essays about numerous subjects: art, food, literature, sports, music, social and political issues. He has also written numerous books on equally numerous subjects, not least books inspired by his own family life on Manhattan, but also in Paris, where he was New Yorker's correspondent for 5 years. And I would like to mention that he's a member of the Légion d'honneur, of the Legion of Honor. He received that from Macron. And we are very happy to have him here with us tonight at a time when very many of us are in desperate need of a well-founded, brilliantly argued, and elegantly formulated liberal optimism. So welcome to the stage, Adam. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. And thank you all for coming here tonight. And I apologize for the absence of my Swedish, and hope I can make it up in the animation of my English. This is the third time I've had the great good fortune of visiting Stockholm in the last few years, and each visit is more interesting than the previous one, more filled with warm greetings, good food, and searchingly, bitterly intelligent conversation. I should add, for those of you who may not know it, that in the 2 years, really, of the pandemic in New York, one of the obsessions of those of us who were locked down and shut up in our apartments, probably the primary obsession of the New York intelligentsia for the past 2 years, has been Nordic television. The extended series coming from Iceland, where people become trapped, or here in Stockholm with the restaurant. You have no idea of how obsessed we all are with everything that has happened in Scandinavia and in the Nordic countries generally. It's what got us through the terrible months of the pandemic. And no Nordic or North Scandinavian series had more impact in New York than Borgen, that wonderful story about a woman prime minister in Denmark. But what impressed us most was not merely that she was a woman and prime minister, but that she called herself a moderate and everybody didn't hate her. Because if you call yourself a moderate in America, you are prey. You are vulnerable to every kind of attack. My book, A Thousand Small Sanities, which I am overjoyed to have now to be able to share with you in Swedish, is in a certain sense a defense of moderation. If you recall, Birgitta Nyborg's party then becomes the New Democrats, which is a more neutral name for the same moderating instinct. But the theme of my book, one of the themes of my book, is exactly that liberals are not centrists. Liberals are not moderates in that sense. We arrive at the center out of the necessity for compromise. The agora in ancient Greek cities is in the center of the town because everyone can get there. And that is thematic for my book throughout, and it's thematic of my beliefs about what liberalism is. I begin my book and I try to locate my idea, my tradition of liberalism, very specifically in a moment in time. It's a moment in the 1830s and 1840s and beyond when the two greatest figures of English liberalism, John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, and his partner, his lover, and eventually his wife, Harriet Taylor, are working secretly together because she's married to another man. And they meet together at the London Zoo in front of the rhinoceros cage day after day because they realize this is what it takes a philosopher to understand, that everyone will be looking at the rhinoceros and no one will be looking at the couple on the bench. And on that bench in the London Zoo, they imagine two great books, what will become two great books. On liberty, Mill's great endorsement, Mill's great statement of the necessity of absolute freedom to the maximum possible for each of us to speak as we want, to practice as we want, to worship as we want. And at the same time, they work on the book called On the Subjection of Women, which is one of the first great manifestos for women's emancipation, not merely for women's suffrage, for the right to vote, but much more broadly for the absolute equality of the sexes. Both of these are books that we stand on today, and what fascinates me about them, and exactly where I think they mark a liberal tradition that lives on into our time, is that they seem at first to be opposites. On the one hand, the absolute information of the liberty of the individual. On the other, a search for what we would now call social justice, for people acting in solidarity to relieve and emancipate an oppressed class and kind, women. And yet, what's extraordinary about this particular liberal vision is that there seems to be no tension between those two visions. On the contrary, John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor imagine those two things as necessary and complementary. They see it as a question of the power of human development, that there's no point in having political freedom unless you have the freedom of self-development, the possibility of becoming a better self. There's no point in having more bread and butter in the world unless you're able to eat the bread and butter while you listen to Mozart. That's the core idea, and that you cannot feel free in yourself as an individual citizen, speaking your mind, expressing your liberty, unless that same liberty is extended to all of your fellow citizens of every race and class and kind and sex. That's the crucial idea, and a radical idea that's at the heart of the liberal tradition as I understand it and as I try to explore it in this book. In that very specific sense, that liberalism, that liberal tradition, is not in any sense a merely centrist tradition, even if it ends in the center. It isn't a merely moderate tradition, even if it also often uses moderate means to arrive at its ends. No, that's a tradition of what I call radicals of the real. People with visions, men and women with visions of reducing the cruelty in the world, of extending our compassion and our idea of citizenship in broader and broader circles, but at the same time understanding that those kinds of transformational, fundamental changes can only take place through the slow, incremental construction of coalitions of kinds who, over time, begin to see the necessity, the plausibility, and eventually the inevitability of social change. We've seen that in the United States just in the past 15 years with gay marriage, which went from something that was unsayable to something that was implausible to something that was controversial to something that is now, in large part, accepted. That's the model of radical liberal transformation that I try to deal with in the book. Because the key thing about that kind of change is, once it's arrived, we no longer fully understand just how radical it really is. It becomes part of the commonplace currency of our civilization, and we can lose, through a very dangerous kind of amnesia, exactly how valuable that is. That's the liberal tradition that I try to articulate, express, defend to my daughter in this particular book, because the book takes the form of a long letter I'm writing to my daughter on the occasion of Donald Trump's election. I don't for a moment want to seem to deprecate or underestimate the threat that liberalism is under, that liberal democracies and the secular and humanist traditions are under these days. Per did a brilliant, succinct job of reminding us of just how much in Europe those traditions are under assault right now. And I hardly need to add that I cannot pick up my phone here in Stockholm without checking back in America and seeing how once again Trump and Trumpism, a vision of pure gangster government, is becoming reborn in the United States, how difficult it is to defeat. No, so I don't for a second want to be blindly or falsely optimistic. If I have any optimism, it comes exactly from the profundity of my pessimism. And by that I mean that I don't believe that liberal democracy, our faith in those ever-expanding circles of compassion and citizenship, I don't believe that that's a movement that's ever been profoundly instantiated, that's one that's been a bulwark of humanity. No, just the opposite. It is always the most fragile of all the ways we have of organizing human society. It's one that's always likely to pass away. In my own not terribly extended lifetime, I've seen at least 3 moments when liberalism or liberal democracy has been guaranteed to be disappearing. People now forget that in the 1970s and in 1980s, it was the cliche of American conservatives, of American anti-liberals, to insist that the Soviet Union had such an organized, militarized, aggressive forward stance that in short order all of Europe would be Finlandized. Does anyone even recall that term now? And that liberal democracy would die. After 9/11, again, which I experienced firsthand, we were told, those of us who defended the liberal values and who defended liberal humanism at that time, we were told, again by reactionaries and conservatives, we were told that once again we were decadent, we lived within a civilization that was hopelessly cosmopolitan, ironic, and self-destructing, and that in the face of this new Islamic militance, we would be helpless. We would be unable to defend our values, and therefore we had to engage in imperial adventures abroad. That, again, proved to be doubly foolish. Foolish in the policies it proposed, but also foolish and blind in not seeing the enormous reservoir of cultural and political and intellectual resources that remained strong within the liberal world. And now here we are once again being told, being warned of the passing, the collapse, as we're told tonight, of the liberal order. And I don't mean for a moment to deprecate that possibility. None of us can see sufficiently far into the future not to imagine that. We have lived through the worst threat to American democracy since the Civil War in the United States in the past 5 years, and that threat, tragically, is not going away. Well, it's not going away on its own. It's something that has to be countered. And the history of liberalism, exactly because true liberalism, the real liberal inheritance that we are the descendants of, is not one of a passive, neutral, procedural centrism. It's exactly a kind of moral adventure. It's exactly a belief in the possibility of human freedom and the parallel possibility of human emancipation, of common emancipation. That tradition is one that we have had to fight for, to reestablish again and again, whether in France, through the history of the creation, destruction, and renewal of the Republic, in the United States, through a series of bloody and demanding confrontations, and everywhere where you find liberal values present, you will always and permanently find liberal values embattled. If the 20th century taught us one lesson, and one lesson alone, it was exactly that liberalism would always be embattled, and it would always be at battle. It would be at battle forever with the authoritarian tendencies of the nationalist right and with the totalitarian tendencies of the Marxist left. That was one of the lessons of the 20th century that we cannot lose. And so, what I would say about the collapse of the liberal order is that the liberal order is always collapsing and always having to be rebuilt and remade by another generation. Because exactly liberalism is not passive, centrist, neutral moderation, though it may arrive at those means of incrementalism and caution in order to achieve its goals, it remains the most powerful form of radical realism that our tradition and our civilization has produced. Because the hardest part about the liberal tradition, as I try to argue in this book, is exactly its successes are easy for us to look past, easy for us to have amnesia about. We forget so readily how uncanny, how unique in human history it is to live in societies in which the right to speak freely is guaranteed. How unique in human history it is to have societies in which the rights of sexual minorities are instantiated not just in tradition, but in constitutions and in laws. We forget, unless we've had the tragic fate of actually living in a totalitarian or authoritarian society, how differently it feels to be able to speak freely to an assembly about what you believe. I can speak out against Trump here, and as of tonight, I don't feel too frightened flying back home to New York, and yet we only have to think of that extraordinary image that many of us saw of Navalny flying back to Russia after having criticized his government with the sure certainty that he would spend the rest of his life in prison and would be disappeared into a Putinist prison. We undervalue the fruits of liberal civilization exactly because they have been so abundant in our lives. And what I call on people to do in this book, and what I ask my daughter to do, and what I would appeal to all of you to reconsider, is exactly reimagining liberal democracy, liberal humanism, that liberal adventure, not as a modest and moderate enterprise, but as one of the greatest moral adventures that humankind has ever known. Thank you so much. Thank you. I stand here paralyzed because I'm not sure what we do next. We're coming around to the
No, I am coming from this direction.
Terrific.
Thank you very much, Adam, for that wonderful speech. I must remember there's a wonderful book, and one of my favorite passages is when Adam likens liberalism to a rhinoceros, a noshörning, and the things the opponents to liberalism believes in is likened with a unicorn. I think we will return to that with the noshörning and the enhörning. So now it's time to welcome the evening's second keynote speaker, Martin Kragh. He is well known to every person in Sweden who has listened to the radio news or have watched TV or read a newspaper at least once during the last 6 months. Martin is a leading Swedish expert on the economical and political development of the Russian Empire in its different versions, past and present, and in that capacity has been one of the most sought-after commentators in Swedish media after Russia's attack on Ukraine in February. And Martin is the Deputy Director of the Stockholm Center for East European Studies and a Senior Research Fellow at the Swedish Institute for Foreign Affairs. He's also an Associate Professor at Uppsala University and a prominent public intellectual, as I mentioned, contributing to, among other papers, Svenska Dagbladet. And his book on Putin ruled Russia, the fallen empire, the Fallna imperiet, went into print just 4 days after the Russian attack on Ukraine. And he managed to include a new foreword, which I would like to quote in a clumsy translation done by me. So it's certainly wrong. But what's going on from Donetsk in the east to Lviv in the west is a fight about the future of Europe, the basic values that unites us and hold us together, an order based on the principles of rule of law, democracy and human rights, an order that now is under threat. Half a year has gone since that. The threat remains. So could you provide us with some hope for the future, Martin? So welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. No, not much more hope, I'm afraid, compared to 6 months ago. Although, of course, my mind today is wandering. A few hours ago, the Ukrainian military launched a counter-offensive for the recapture of their southern region of Kherson, just north of Crimea. And we are reminded of the fact that one of the largest, if not the largest, military conflict in Europe since 1945 is still ongoing. The broader topic of today's event is, of course, one of the big questions facing us today: the decline of the liberal order. And I had prepared these notes that, well, I'm not going to look down at these papers too much, I hope, but my main takeaway is that I don't think, and I agree, I'm in perfect agreement with Adam, whose introduction here is hard to follow, that indeed there was perhaps never a liberal order that existed and around which we had a complete consensus, and that now we need to defend this order. In fact, as he reminded us, this order was always under pressure. I'll just mention, as a university teacher, I'll just go back to some of the basics about what we mean when we talk about a liberal system, a liberal democracy. Well, first of all, the key pillar of the liberal order is not so much about a question about taxation. I mean, in Europe, when you think about a liberal, you think about someone who wants to increase your taxes or decrease them. I mean, whereas in the US, it's typically someone who wants to increase your taxes. But fundamentally, a liberal order is a system based on rule of law, respect for human rights, and domestically, and in terms of interstate relations, it's about respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. And when we look around the world today, we are seeing, of course, that this particular aspect of a liberal order is not doing very well. It's under threat. We also tend to speak about the liberal order in terms of a liberal democracy, and with democracy, well, I don't need to explain it too much. It's about political pluralism, free and fair elections, free media, accountability of decision makers. Also, in this case, we are seeing globally from various places how the emergence of new authoritarian systems from India and Turkey to Russia of course, represent a challenge to the liberal democracy as a norm. In addition, and lastly, when we think about this system, we typically think about liberal countries having engaging with each other in terms of multilateralism. We uphold international trade, the functioning of markets, globalization, and the joint common security through a multilateral order, not through competition, but through cooperation. And it's also a system where, paradoxically, we have assumed that the sole superpower in the US would also uphold this system in the last instance. But if we look across the globe again, we see how, rather than cooperation, we see conflict and fragmentation between the great powers. And we see this in different areas, whether we speak about nuclear disarmament, weapons control, migration, or climate. So President Vladimir Putin's decision to launch a large-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th this year, in my opinion, should not be seen so much as the beginning of a new cycle in world history, as the culmination of decades of tendencies that were at play. We are reminded, when we observe the events ongoing in Eastern Europe, of the fact that we are not observing so much the decline of a particular order as much as a reversion to previous historical norms that never went away. We are seeing in some aspects, in many aspects, the return of history. One of the basic assumptions of the liberal promise was the idea that through integration, through cooperation, economically, multilaterally, we would become more interdependent, and as a result, the risks for conflicts would decline. Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher, famously argued this in his essay on eternal peace. But as I argued, perhaps the framing of today's topic should not be so much a liberal order under threat, question mark, but rather a liberal promise that never had a chance to be completely fulfilled. It's an ideal for which we continue to strive. So, paradoxically, we are now in a situation where, after 3 or 4 decades of globalization, we have now not only dependencies that have enhanced our wealth, that have contributed to economic well-being, that has lifted millions of people from poverty, but we're also seeing how these very linkages that were created and that have become the constitution of the system can also be exploited, and these linkages are therefore also vulnerable. We see this now in Europe, in the ongoing energy crisis, where interdependencies, and particularly the dependency on Russian natural gas in Germany, has created a challenge for us across the continent. We saw it a few years ago only with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the inability of states to cooperate with the distribution and production of vaccines. Before concluding, I'll just mention a few other areas where perhaps in the after the following panel discussion, we could point to a few other areas where these linkages are currently becoming increasing sources of conflict. We see it in terms of economic warfare between states. The Western states, the EU, UK, the US have in some ways discovered their potence, if you like, the geopolitical strength of using economic leverage against countries that are otherwise militarily quite strong, such as Russia. But we are also seeing globally how value chains are being disrupted. Multinational corporations, when I was in business school 25 or 20 years ago, we were taught, the consensus was that just in time is the sort of idea of companies who want to have increased maximum efficiency. Now companies are striving for just about time. It's good enough, because they have realized that in order to function, you need warehouses, you need various points of production. You cannot depend on one source of production only. So security concerns of companies, of states, of people, and not only market efficiency have become more prominent. We also see this in the way we have started discussing the organization of our basic infrastructure, the energy supply systems. Although Crimea was taken from Ukraine by Russia already 8.5 years ago, Germany went ahead and built the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Finland initiated the construction of a large nuclear power plant with the Russian energy company Rosatom, which incidentally also happens to have the responsibility for Russia's nuclear weapons. China is, of course, the growing economic superpower in Asia. And through its Belt and Road Initiative, they are buying harbors, they are buying airfields, they are buying railways, and they are investing in infrastructure globally. The purpose for this is not, of course, only solely altruistic or economic, it's also political. It's a way of gaining influence and leverage. It's a way of imposing the Communist Party of China's vision on the world. We also see it in the digital arena. This is more difficult to handle for democracies because most of the innovation in the digital sphere is driven by private companies. In several areas, however, rather than having joint platforms that would help companies act globally and create these very sort of global supply chains and ideas of global economic trade that we got used to, we are now seeing fragmentation of technological standards. It's because people started to distrust each other, and often for good reasons. Semiconductors, 5G, 6G, softwares, algorithms, machine learning, intellectual property, all these areas are critical to our security, and we are observing how states attempt to create sovereignty over more of these areas. The fourth area where we are seeing fragmentation in cross-border movements is the issue of migration, and how migration has triggered old fears, but also has been a source of conflict when it was instrumentalized by dictatorships such as the one by Lukashenko when he started 2 years ago to exploit migrants as a source of political retaliation against the European Union. Since Putin launched his large-scale assault on Ukraine, 5 million Ukrainians, women and children mostly, have left the country for Europe. 4 million are in Poland. We also see how other countries, such as Turkey, have exploited similar conflicts in the Middle East for their benefit. As a result, quite predictably, new fences are being built, new barriers are being erected. It's not only between the US and Mexico, it's a global phenomenon. We now have more kilometers of barriers than we did when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. Lastly, of course, it's hard not to think about the global organizations that were supposed to keep this system relatively intact. What we see is today the weaknesses of key organizations such as the United Nations, the WTO, and the OSCE, and they are unable to function as they were originally intended, and they are also being systematically repurposed by authoritarian states such as China and Russia that are cooperating in the Security Council of the UN. And we're also seeing the emergence of new organizations that have no international global ambitions to unite states, but rather to create regional blocs that will then increase, that will then participate in not cooperation, but rather parallel multilateral systems that will not coexist, but be in competition with each other. So I am in agreement, absolutely, with Adam's key argument that the liberal order is a system that was never taken for granted. It was never simply maintained. It was always defended. Thank you.
So we are back and we are joined by Åsa Wikfors and Sten Widman. Åsa is a professor of philosophy at University of Stockholm with a PhD from Columbia.
Yep.
Yeah, and also a member of the Swedish Academy. And in her research and her role as a public intellectual, has focused on the functioning and consequences, I would say, of misinformation, disinformation, alternative facts, post-truths, whatever you will call it. And she's right now leading an international research program on that topic. And in 2017, she published her acclaimed book Alternativa Fakta, Alternative Facts. And last year it was followed by Därför demokrati, om kunskapen och folkstyret, the case for democracy, we would say in English.
Yeah, the case for or why democracy, no question mark.
Yeah, which she had written with her brother, actually.
Yeah.
Morten
Yeah.
Wikfors. Sten Widman is a professor of political science at Uppsala University, focusing, among other subjects, on international democratic development and conflicts, and leader of a research project ongoing called the Open Society. And he has, with his colleague Thomas Persson, edited the recently published anthology Skör demokrati, Fragile Democracy. So I started with you also. You have arrived almost directly from a conference on the effects of new information technology on democracy, and you have some scary information to share with us.
Yes, we had 3 days of misery there. No, but it was very exciting. We have a large research program on knowledge resistance, really. But of course, knowledge resistance is a complex consequence of an interaction between cognitive mechanisms and the external information environment. So a lot of the conference was about the new information technology and what it does to us. And the title of the conference was Knowledge Resistance in a High Choice Information Environment. And that's the situation. It's sort of high choice. We moved from this situation where we had a few fairly reliable sources to this infinite set of choices. And we're not very well equipped to make those choices. And that's the sort of challenge. So one thing I can just share with you, there were lots of, we had 8 international keynote speakers and then internal researchers speaking. But one thing that I thought was striking was because there is this idea that was not completely wrong, that social media would democratize the public discourse, right? And it does on a level because, of course, it allows people to bypass the gatekeepers, the traditional media and so on, and speak their voices. And in some cases, it's been a very useful thing. Police brutality is documented by ordinary people in the streets, and it's spread, so that it has that function. But it also has some really scary sides to it. And one thing that came from this talk was the idea that we all have a voice on social media, equal voice and so on. No, we don't, not at all. So there was a recent study looking at, so there's 72 million users on Facebook in just the US, I think. But anyhow, the public, for example, in the US, the public debate on Facebook, this was a Facebook study, that it looks like there are millions and millions and millions and millions of people involved, is actually completely determined by 500 super users. So the talk was called The Supremacy Super Users. These 500 people are, for the most part, white supremacists, spreading serious disinformation, hatred, misogynistic propaganda, conspiracy theories, COVID, all of that, and inciting violence. And these people dominate the discussion. The rest, the other millions and millions of users, are not part of the public discussion. So instead of moving from a situation where we had traditional media kind of dominating the public discourse, we have a situation where we have these supremacy super users dominating the public discourse, and that's a really scary situation.
Really, and because you conclude and you that no country has ever been moved from being fully democratic to being an autocracy without the help of disinformation.
Yeah, short of military coups, of course, because those happen. Yeah, and that we know, we have a lot of research showing that this autocratization process is going across the world now. And like the Institute of Varieties of Democracy in Gothenburg, they've documented this very carefully. And what you see in country after country, except for the countries where there are military coups, is exactly this. You have more or less stable democracies. It can be in new democracies, like in Hungary, but also old democracies, like in the US, where the autocratization process is ongoing and where disinformation, especially conspiracy theories, play an absolutely essential role. So if you're going to move democracy fully or have developed democracy to an autocracy, you need disinformation. And social media and alternative media plays an absolutely pivotal role in that. So, yeah.
And Sten, the Open Society, the name of your research project is a direct reference to the giant in philosophy and political thought, Karl Popper, who wrote a book called The Open Society and Its Enemies. And could you develop on this and why you chose that name and the relevance of the Popper and Popperian thought, so to speak, today?
It's a really hard question. It's an important message in the thinking of Karl Popper and his theories on knowledge and science that we can't reach definite truths, but we can have provisional truths. And this is important to remember when we deal with what is called facts and, on the other hand, politics. Because this is a thing which maybe we were better at separating two before, but today the two seems to be conflated or brought together in a way so that we find it harder to have political discussions about where the responsibility of the politicians and also the electorate starts and where it ends. So that is a general remark from Popper that you can use when you try to debate what is a good debate, what is a useful debate, and such things. But the forces that we are up against are immense. And I don't want to bring down, I really liked your message today, Adam, in the way that you portrayed it, that we have so much which is so valuable in our developments that we see here that we can use to preserve and fight for liberal values and democracy. But the challenges are astounding as well. I'm thinking about comparing the US with Sweden. Mm-hmm. During the McCarthy era, self-censorship in the United States was surprisingly low. About 13% of the population would say that they had to self-censor themselves in open discussions, debates, and so on, because voicing their opinions could lead to repercussions and so on. Now today, that number in the United States is around 50%. When we went out and measured that in Sweden, we found that the same number applies to Sweden. About 50% of the Swedes are afraid to openly say things because they feel that they can offend someone, they will be silenced, and so on. So this is something which goes on within society, a big threat that we're silencing ourselves. And then the next formidable threat comes from the great powers of history which are moving us in certain directions. For example, the debate we have on the environment and how we should save the planet. We are increasingly looking towards technocratic solutions. Technocracy could solve the problem of the kind of hardships and the degradation of the environment that we see today. It's argued that we should pause democracy, right? But authoritarian states are not very good at saving the environment, right? So that's a trap there we have to watch out for, absolutely. And then we have what you could say the mighty power moving towards us, which is the, you could use symbolic language of the Father, which is China, and the Son, which is Russia, and then you have the Holy Ghost, which is, of course, inflation. This thing which is so hard to grasp, but which may be the most powerful force that can threaten democracy at a global level. This is, it reflects in the Varieties of Democracy project when they measure what is the share of population living in autocracies today. In 2011, it was 49%. Today, it is 70%. Freedom House made a measurement on what is the share of population living with totally free media. 3 years ago, it was 13%. So we are sitting here, and we're so used to this kind of a debate climate and the media we have access to that it's hard to imagine what goes on in other places, which you described today, Martin, which is also a very valuable presentation too, I think. So we have these internal forces, these internal movements, and then you have these large forces of history which will change things. And how we are to resist that is a huge challenge.
This is a question to you all. Looking at the last issue of the the magazine The Economist, and they have these cartoons. And last week, the cartoon in The Economist showed a castle with a sign, freedom of expression. And it was a besieged castle surrounded by 4 enemy forces, a radical right, autocrats and despots, religious zealots, and illiberal left. Would you say that this is a relevant image of liberal democracy, as also of liberal democracy in a broader sense, of the situation for the liberal democracy? It's besieged by these 4 forces? Or Martin?
Well, yeah, well, of course, one could square this circle in many ways, but I would add perhaps one other dimension. When the internet became sort of a household phenomena 30 years ago in Sweden and eventually across the whole world, from the US and across the globe, it was thought of as a horizontal process, and people were communicating horizontally. But what happened, and it was interesting when you mentioned how we had before this system of people relying on a few sort of quite predictable sources of information. They were on TV, on radio, and newspapers. And then for a short while, we had this horizontal system of information sharing until this was then sort of turned on its head. And with the creation of social media companies, we now again have these quite vertical sources of information, because when people are consuming and getting their information, they're not getting it through these horizontal structures anymore, visiting websites. They're accessing all of this information vertically, and they're fed this through algorithms and so on that you cannot easily understand why you're being fed certain information. Most of the time you're being fed rubbish, like marketing stuff, but sometimes it can also create havoc with political systems, like we have seen in certain countries in the world where these algorithms were sort of manipulated to create, extreme political conflict.
Yep. Can I just add another research finding from last week, which is this fascinating thing that, so what do? You've been taught that if you read something that you suspect may not be true, you Google, you try to find out from other sources. So what happens when people plunge in some terms from an article that's not very plausible or reliable? What happens then? Well, because the way search words function, the search mechanisms are set up, if you read an even unreliable text and you take some words from that and put it in, you will end up with more misinformation. Because these words trigger that part of the media system. So the idea, but if you end up with a true article and you search, you will end up with reliable information. Right. So there was a journalist there from Swedish radio. She said, well, that's so interesting. We should use like really crazy conspiracy terms in our search engines, search terms that we recommend to people at Swedish radio, because then they could end up with reliable information instead. But anyhow, that's an example of algorithms. Even when we try to find out how things are, we're led into this dungeons of misinformation.
It's the kind of the most pernicious and yet in its way the most grotesquely comic of those is Jew. If you Google the word Jew, you get nothing but violent anti-Semitic sites. So Google has tried to cover it by saying, please Google Jewish, not Jew.
There you go. Excellent example. Yeah.
So it goes on. Let me just respond quickly to your remarks about Karl Popper, because that was the book that transformed my life when I was a teenager, was reading The Open Society and Its Enemies, to the degree, and this is a relic from another time, that I wrote Popper a letter when I was 19, and he invited me to visit him in the English countryside. I wrote a piece about my 2 encounters with Popper, actually, in the New Yorker once. 2 things I think are worth remembering. One underlines one of the points I was trying to make about the embattled nature of liberal thought. Popper wrote that great book in exile in New Zealand, not even in exile in Britain. The only place that he, as a Austrian Jewish intellectual, could find refuge in 1939 was in New Zealand, which was a long way away for a German-speaking intellectual. The second thing I'd add about it is that the one thing that, in retrospect, and this speaks to what you two have been talking about, that's missing, it seems to me, from Popper's great account of the Open Society, is exactly the structures that we now call civic capital or social capital. Popper doesn't particularly imagine that without those structures of social trust, that you can't have a working democracy. That's not vital to his vision of it. And yet it seems to me if there's one big transformation in our thinking about the basis, the foundations of democracy in the past 40 years, it's exactly, Martin and I were talking about this last night, and Martin made the point that one reason that Ukraine had been able to resist earlier internal attempts at autocracy was exactly because they had a sufficiently resilient social capital within Ukraine to prevent that kind of coup d'etat. And there's no bigger question, exactly as you were saying, than about what we all imagined that when the horizontal internet began, that it would be the ideal medium for making social currency, because what could be better, right? Then you can, and yet the degree to which that's been betrayed, whether it's betrayed by the nature of the technology or by the malice of the technologists, is a big question, it seems to me. But just to make a prescriptive point, it does seem as though that old formula, that the stronger the social capital, the stronger the institutions of trust, the stronger all the places where people can gather and share without with people who are not of their kind, who are not of their clan, the stronger society is. And that, I think, we mustn't underestimate the degree to which that remains true. One of the most moving conversations I've had in the past year was with an Iranian woman activist who was actually almost assassinated a few weeks ago in New York, who made the point that coffee houses in Tehran remain an extraordinarily powerful way of women to be able to come together and take off their veils and see each other literally face to face. And the religious police are constantly trying to suppress and extinguish coffee houses where women can go, and there's such a powerful social appetite for it that they're constantly being renewed. Now, that seems to me a dramatic, if you like, a romantic, but nonetheless a very urgent example of the continuing power of commonplace culture to underline and anchor democracy.
Mm. No, I mean, I think that's right, and I think, like it's good you mentioned trust here, because that's such a central thing in this. And Sweden, I mean, when you talk about Swedish democracy, there's some hope because we have high levels of trust. And we have interpersonal trust, and we have trust in institutions. But, and here's a big but, this is what's going on in Sweden now, is that the trust in institutions, democratic institutions, is being increasingly politically polarized. So if you're on the right, on the far, and the populist party, very, very low trust in democratic institutions and in public service. One thing about Popper, he did not say that you can't reach truth at all. So we can discuss that. What he said was that you can't prove things, but that's a point about evidence. You need to be fallibilist about that. That's a different point.
Yeah, Sten has been waving a while because he also wants to say something about Popper.
I have two reservations about the way that you argue about truth and the role of social capital and trust right now. And the first thing then is about the truth. We tend to say, as you do in your book, for example, that we have researchers and we have free journalists who can deliver the truth and so on, right?
But they can deliver knowledge.
Yes. In 2020, Dagens Nyheter is supposed to be a reliable source of truth, said that Sweden had the highest levels of excess deaths in the world or Europe, and that the model for combating the effects of the COVID pandemic was to look at China. Today we know that Sweden has among the lowest levels of excess death during 2020 to 2022. And because we kept our society more open than others. That's the first thing. There's no easy way to find truths in just saying that journalists and science can do this for us.
What does that have to do with
wait,
truth?
I'm not finished yet. I'm not finished.
Sorry.
So that's a process. We have to deal with difficult information all the time. And if we rely on something as absolute truths, we can get into real problematic situations, for example, as relying on China. Second thing is that I agree that we need social capital and trust, but we know these things are not in themselves saving democracy. they can be used in many ways. So, for example, in India, the fall of its democracy was via the society, the civic organizations in India that were turned into the machines working for Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party. Same thing as in the Weimar Republic, if you read William Scherer, for example. It was civil society that was the instrumental force that finished democracy in the Weimar Republic. So we can't just say that we just need trust and we just need civic organizations and such things, because it's not there in itself. It doesn't work that way.
Could I return to these four enemies? Because I'm right-wing extremists, illiberal left, autocrats, and religious zealots. Because I think it's interesting to see, to ask if those forces, if you can recognize, if they are somehow cooperating, working together, consciously or unconsciously. Can one say a joint, so to speak, a joint force against attacking democracy? Simon? Oh, Martin.
Well, historically, that was clearly the case. I mean, in Weimar Germany, the weak democracy was simultaneously attacked by the communists on the far left with the support of the Soviet Union, and you had the far right and the National Socialists. And of course, eventually, one of those groups took power, and they used that power then to crush also the communist opposition with Hitler at the bay of that movement. And in Russia in the 1990s, I mean, Putin didn't invent a liberal sort of Russian autocracy. I mean, that was the main leading opposition to Yeltsin in the 90s, came from the communists, the Soviet sort of nostalgics, the Stalinists on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fascists in the Liberal Democratic Party. That was the main opposition, and Putin simply took some of those arguments from those groups and made them his own, and then he used that to dismantle whatever fragile democracy there was. So of course you can see how indirectly or directly at many points in history groups that are nominally on different aspects, different sides of a political spectrum can actually combine to create very illiberal outcomes.
Classic red-brown collaboration.
Because I must ask you, Adam, about your likening a liberal society with a rhinoceros.
Yes.
And could you describe it? Because that's not exactly a self-evident metaphor, I think.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I wanted to call my book originally The Rhinoceros Manifesto. And my American publisher said, we can't publish a book called The Rhinoceros Manifesto because all you'll do is explain to people what you mean by it. The only place in the world where it was published as The Rhinoceros Manifesto was in Italy, where it's the Manifesto Rinascere, and with the subtitle, Liberalism e Amore, Liberalism and Love. And it occurred to me that every book that's published in Italian probably has that subtitle, you know, whatever you write about.
And the rhinoceros.
Yes, exactly. So they got around the rhinoceros by emphasizing the amore, you know. But what I meant by that is simply that most of our utopian schemes of political improvement have the form of unicorns. They're shining, marvelous, attractive, seductive, and they don't exist. They don't actually exist. And liberalism, in my metaphor, is like a rhinoceros. It's ugly, it's squat, it's muddy, it lives in sloppiness, and yet it's a formidable animal on its own terms, and it has the enormous advantage of actually existing. And that is why we're drawn to it. And even though it's ugly, but existent and formidable in its way. Just coming back to the question of social capital, which I'm an essayist, not a social scientist, and I hesitate to dogmatize on any such question. But it does seem to me that when, in the sense in which that I'm inclined to talk about liberal institutions, social capital, civic trust, and so on, isn't so much in terms of political parties or church groups or groups who are brought together by a common belief, because it seems to me those are the kinds of groups that played such a destructive role in Weimar and so on. It's everything from paramilitaries to Facebook groups now who come together in that way around a political or theological orthodoxy. The sense in which I would use social capital, I think it's the sense in which someone like Robert Putnam, sociologist, uses it, is exactly to talk about institutions that are not in themselves politicized, are not in themselves overtly political, in which people of very different, as I said before, very different backgrounds, ideologies, kinds, and without kinship ties, or even without ideological ties, find themselves having to work together, having to coexist, whether they want to or not. There's a wonderful book by a scholar named Pinsker that I wrote about in the New Yorker about the role of the coffee house, coming back to that example, in the emancipation of, in the Enlightenment and then in the emancipation of Polish Jews as well, that having a neutral meeting place where people of very, very different points of view could learn to coexist was a very important engine for I will say without hesitation, for the progress of European society. So that's the sense in which I intend it, not simply non-governmental groups that come together. And I think that remains hugely valuable as a concept. And I wonder, is there any positive sense in which you can see in this conference or in anything else exactly that kind of activity taking place in the digital world?
Well, so that's an interesting, so there's a whole area of research called innovations in democracy, right? So that's the question now. What can we do? We are in a different place than we were, say, 100 years ago when modern democracy developed. And we had these, people's movements in various ways and these social. But like now, young people, they're very politically engaged, but they don't, for example, they don't join parties. They don't have these, and they're online all the time. So one interesting idea is if you can use the digital platforms, of course, for the kind of thing that for good deliberative democracy. And it's been tried in some places. You have these citizen forums. That's one way to innovate democracy. And it's been shown to counteract populism when you have citizen forums, because people get to, not decide, but advisory citizen forums. Can you do that online? That's really interesting. They've tried it in Taiwan to an extent, and that's really worked well there, because they also had a storming of their presidential building and so on. So, but they have managed to make the democracy work really well, and there the digital platforms have been used for that purpose. So surely, if there would be a way of using digital technology for helping and supporting democracy, but we're not there yet. And the people who are using democracy, the digital technology to dismantle democracy, they're way ahead of us. So that we have to. That's just how it is. And so we need to try to catch up there. So absolutely, that's a very interesting idea. But trust, of course, no, it's not necessary. It's not sufficient for democracy. I mean, you can't just have trust, but you have to have other things too. But trust is necessary, I think. But it has to be not misplaced trust. And this is another problem in the high-choice information environment. That so much of the trust is misplaced. So people don't trust research, and they don't trust traditional media, but they trust some guy sitting in a basement producing his own channel on COVID. Right, and that's strange, and that's a challenge that we have.
Just to add to that, though, don't we also run the risk of the social media mirage? And I'm thinking about in the United States in the last presidential campaign, everyone was ferociously online on Twitter. If you supported Bernie Sanders, you felt yourself surrounded by Bernie supporters. The only politician, and of course Trump on the right, the only politician who had almost no social media presence was Joe Biden, who was eventually the victor. That could have been an anachronism. That could have been the last politician who had that. But it did seem to be more of a mirage than many people had expected. As you remember, one of the things that people said at the end of 2020, Twitter is not the world. We learned that, right? Yeah. Twitter is not the real world.
But I imagine there was a lot of social media campaigns around him. So
yes, but
I don't think you can win an election in the U.S. or anywhere else without that.
Without some social.
Sten.
I'm picking on you all the time. But I'll just have
Please
to
do.
I can't avoid doing that. Sorry. No, but I mean, when all these explanations about making democracy work with horizontal organizations that are non-hierarchical, that works well when you have a well-functioning democracy. So we tend to think then, well, it should be that kind of organizations that we have and support in society. They don't have a politicized agenda, right? So that we increase contact between groups, cross-cutting loyalties, overarching contacts, and all these things, right? But the thing is that there is, it seems that these organizations can be switched on to become something else very quickly. And this is exactly William Shearer's point in the rise and fall of the Third Reich. So we can't trust them. And also these very, very vertical organizations that have this strict hierarchy, they can be the best protection for minorities in times of autocratization. Ahmadiyya Muslims, Jews also, for example, that they can protect you also in a time of liberal crisis, you could say.
Yes, I don't mean to have too, well, as we'd say in America, too Pollyanna-ish a view of the power of social capital, but it is a striking phenomenon that you can see documented again and again, that on the whole, places with, my favorite example of it in American history is in the life of Frederick Law Olmsted, the great designer of Central Park, who very few people know was a journalist and a writer before he ever designed an inch of green space. And he went to the American South before the Civil War, and he said, this is a terrible society, and why is it a terrible society? Not just because it's a slave society, though that would be enough, but because it's a paralyzed society. It has no social movement compared to the North. And the reason he designed Central Park was not to make a pretty green space in the middle of New York, but to create an environment in which fundamentally different people, immigrants, proletariats, plutocrats, could all have one shared space. And not to over-idealize it, but that was an extraordinarily effective piece of social engineering through trees and grass, which remains an extraordinarily effective piece of social engineering. That is clearly not a solution to, we will not solve Putin by building another park in Moscow. I have no illusions about that. But those kinds of institutions, things as small as university presses and good publishing houses, and things as non-intellectual seeming as parks, I nonetheless think play a more significant role in building the foundation of free societies than we sometimes credit.
Martin, I was going to ask you, but you
No, please go ahead.
Yeah. Returning to the war, because that's the most concrete expression of violent authoritarianism at the moment. So how long do you think the solidarity, the Western liberal solidarity of Ukraine will last in regarding all this illiberal forces working within the West, so to speak?
You mean how long the support for Ukraine
can
continue in consideration of the forces in our own society?
Yeah, since there are a lot of forces in our own societies that are clearly not, per definition,
let's call them not pro-Ukrainian.
Yeah, per definition or nature or so on, who are rather pro-Putin.
Well, yeah, we are already seeing a peculiar new sort of fragmentation within the West. So the biggest sort of supporters in absolute terms, in terms of military support, economic support for Ukraine, has come from the US and the UK on the one hand, and the Central European countries on the other hand. So Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and a few other states like that. Then you have the old Europe, as it was sort of denounced. You remember 20 years ago by Rumsfeld, I think, on the sort of older
France and Germany.
Yeah, France. More being considered not necessarily fence sitters, but not as actively engaged in the support. So that could be a source of friction. If we're unlucky, France will have a president who, in early February, was still pushing out millions of pamphlets to French households, where the front picture of the pamphlet was her shaking hands, smiling with Vladimir Putin. I'm talking about Marine Le Pen.
Right.
And it's no coincidence that people such as the French, the Russian fascist ideologue Alexander Dugin, whose daughter was killed in a car bomb last week outside of Moscow, that for 30 years he was actually trying to build these very networks that are now being used by Moscow actively. These very networks that created already in the 90s with the far right on the one hand, and to a certain extent also the far left. Dugin was, for example, very popular within certain circles of the Greek party Syriza 5-6 years ago. And what they share is this general sort of contempt for what they see as an unjust US-led order. They attach low values to sort of the Western ideals, liberal principles. And they tend to believe that leaders such as Putin, in their misguided understanding of what Russia actually is, that they think that a personality like Putin is a person who could provide order. And that's what they primarily seek, is some sort of order imposed from above, and they see that in Putin. But of course, when you look at the consequences of his policies, what you see in Russia is they are now becoming quickly moving towards a totalitarian state domestically, and abusing their neighbors with military force externally. So it's the opposite of stability and order, but that's not. I mean, that's not the perspective of these very groups of supporters of Putin. So yes, that could certainly be a factor. Then you have the economic consequences of the war, the inflation, the unemployment that will follow inevitably unless central banks are able to contain this, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of difficulties, but I tend to be more optimistic though now than a year ago about the possibility of the Europe together with allies to hold this together. But of course it could break, and there are frictions.
Yeah, what would happen if Trump or Trumpism returns to power, presidential power? Then you have, I mean, it's the most important Western power.
Well, if I may say there, and I don't think we should ever look past the power of contingency and the individual. I think in that particular case, if Trump returned to power, he would withdraw the United States from NATO, and he would be actively pro-Putin. There was a very frightening piece on the cover of the New York Times this morning about the degree to the frightening pattern in which American confidential agents, spies in plain English, have been betrayed over the past year, with the very powerful implication that it was coming out of Trump. It was coming out of the confidential documents that Trump stole. That's an almost unimaginable notion, but it was the front page story in the New York Times today. What I was going to add, though, is I think that a lot of that is peculiar to Trump's own malign nature. I think if Trumpism, that is, the Republican Party, came back to power, I would be surprised if that were a strongly pro-Putin party. It would certainly be a strongly, in many respects, anti-democratic party. But the tropism towards Putin, I think, is part of Donald Trump's deeply malignant and deranged nature. I don't think it's a general conviction shared by the American right.
I mean, for 30 years, the Americans were telling Europe, you have to be able to maintain your own security and keep, people like Milosevic and Putin under control. Yeah. And after 30 years, the European great powers were unable to learn this lesson, underinvesting in basic security. And now we see again the over-reliance. I mean, Ukrainians are grateful for American support, but it's difficult to understand why, considering how wealthy the Western European countries are, that this military supply has to come from across the Atlantic.
Couldn't you argue, Martin, that given what expectations that the concert of democracies, however imperfect they are in so many ways, have actually, including Sweden and Finland and NATO, have actually behaved with more solidarity and more unity than one might have expected 5 years ago if you had gamed this out?
Well, yes. I mean, I think if you look at civil society reactions across Europe, the consensus is very strong. You see it not only in the EU and the UK and so on. I mean, I was recently on a trip to Georgia, Armenia, even though those countries have very complicated security dilemmas with Russia and other countries like Turkey and Azerbaijan. It's obvious where the heart of the people live. You have the case of Kazakhstan, where a president or a leader was basically installed by Moscow less than a year ago, and only a few months ago. He was sitting next to Atambayev was sitting next to Putin in St. Petersburg, saying we will never recognize parts of Ukraine as belonging to Russia, and so in fact Russia is isolated, and therefore I mean that's why I'm arguing that the support should be increased now to Ukraine, because we have the momentum. We shouldn't wait and create another protracted war in Europe for the next 10 years.
I mean, I think the big danger, again, to come back to misinformation there, is that they're going to try to exploit divisions within our Western democracies, because there are strong populist voter bases in all of these countries now. And the kind of issues they would like to push, of course, are things like gas prices and things like that, that divide and increase polarization. So you make it difficult for the Western democracies to keep their stance, because it will cost, right, to hold a stance. It will cost. You will have to do unpopular things like, decreasing energy and so on. And the populists stand ready to exploit this. And in Sweden, the populist channels, the alternative media, they have been very, very close contact with Russia Today and so on. They've been channeling their messages for years and years. So the ground is prepared there, and it will be very easy for that kind of influence campaigns to kick into these to our Western democracies.
Sten,
Yes.
in your book, in your own the text in the book, if I remember right, you write somewhere that the book Fragile Democracy, the book you've been editing, deals mostly with movements and people who see themselves as democratic but has lost contact with the functioning of democracy. Could you explain what you mean by that? People that see themselves as democratic but has lost contact with the functioning of democracy.
Okay, I was going to use this opportunity to say something about Martin's argument.
Okay, do that. Return to the other things.
Because that was really interesting. Just one quick thing about what you said. Okay, so Russia we can see them as isolated, okay? In the 70s, I think that many politicians in the West overestimated how China and the Soviet Union were sort of aligned or working in the same direction, but they weren't. Today, it seems that we are assuming that Russia and China are not that tightly, working together, but they are. So even if Russia is isolated here, it's a state which is entangled with China. So there comes the real risk of, or the great hindrance towards cooperating towards Russia in the war in Ukraine, I would say. Would you agree with that? This entanglement is so difficult, and maybe we can return to that question later.
Well,
I just want to hear what you say about that.
Early February, around the time of the Beijing Olympics, Putin went over there with his sort of delegation, and with Xi Jinping, they signed this document proclaiming the unlimited friendship between Russia and China. And after more than 6 months of war, I don't see any support forthcoming to Russia from China. I haven't seen any military support. I have seen very little economic support, because the Chinese Communist Party, they are communist in form, but they are very capitalist in content. And they want to avoid getting dragged into the sanctions war. They understand the risks. And the Chinese banks are not investing in Russia, they are disinvesting. And China can do that because they are economically much more powerful, and the sort of economic distance between Russia and China will only grow over the years. And so Russia will become more dependent on China, which suits them very well, because they are communist, but they are also nationalist and imperialist in Beijing, just like Putin. And of course, what happens when one of those forces when these forces eventually meet is, there will probably be some sort of a domination. And my impression is that the Chinese are simply waiting for Putin to become even weaker. And as he becomes weaker, Europe is not buying any more gas and oil from him. So he's going to Beijing saying, let's build a new pipeline. And the Chinese say, yes, sure. but we need a 30% discount, because that's what they're getting now.
Yeah.
And that's what India is getting. I mean, that's the only reason they're not voting with Ukraine in the UN. It's because they're just anticipating these, well, short-term economic benefits of being able to exploit Russia's weaknesses. But the world is slowly but surely moving to an economy where fossil fuel demand will decline. We are electrifying our cars and our transport. We are moving towards renewables and other sources of energy that are not fossil dependent. So Russia, I mean, it was clear that Putin didn't sort of preside over an economic model of the future. But maybe before the war, he had 20, 30 years. But now with Europe sort of reducing rapidly its dependence on Russian fossil fuels, this sort of end date of the Russian growth model will only happen much sooner. And the Chinese see this, and then they're going to use that.
Can I just
a
slightly different subject, which I amputated from my own discourse, but which I was sure would come back at us vehemently, and that is the relation between the liberalism that we have all been describing and defending and what's called generically neoliberalism. That is the globalization, the confidence in free markets extended in every direction that seemed part of the inheritance of the Thatcher-Reagan period in the 80s and the fall of the wall and the rest of it. Because one of the things that I write about the liberal tradition, I think is crucial, is that it has a corrective conscience installed in its engine. It's part of its DNA. And I think one continuing area of self-scrutiny that anyone who defends the liberal tradition has to think about is exactly the connection between liberalism in the political sense and liberalism in the economic sense. And the degree to which, exactly as you were describing, Martin, the degree to which it now seems increasingly apparent that the classic imagined connection between free markets and free peoples has been exploded, that it's perfectly possible to have a free market society that does not entail of necessity civil liberties on a broader scale, and that the belief that was so dominant a mere 20 years ago in the emancipatory potential just of free markets, all those terrible cliches about how no two countries which each has a McDonald's has ever gone to war or ever will go to war. Those were platitudes that were repeated and have clearly been exploded. And I think that if there's a job for those of us who defend liberal democracy to do, it's exactly not to evade, but to address directly the difficulties and the entanglements of liberalism with what's called neoliberalism.
Well, McDonald's has now left
Russia,
and it was rebranded under a new sort of Russian brand. So I guess this statistical correlation
it still holds.
Still holds.
Still holds.
As long as McDonald's moves away from the countries.
But is there a McDonald's in Kiev?
Yes.
Oh, so
yeah. I mean, one of the actually, together with a colleague, 2 years ago, we engaged in a research project in Mariupol. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the sort of fascinating aspects of that was that one of the great plans of the mayor of Mariupol at the time was that to reconstruct the city center and to place in the middle a McDonald's as a sign of sort of westernization of Ukraine. Now, of course, Mariupol was completely destroyed.
Mm-hmm. We could spend the rest of the night here. We're not going to do that. So I think I have to wrap up this discussion. But I would one last question. You have to answer very shortly because it's a very simple one. What would you say is the most important thing to do or not to do in order to safeguard liberal democracy?
Well, do something about the dominance of social media, disinformation and propaganda and hateful and threats that's there. And do something intelligent, mind you. not censorship, right? That's not what we're talking about. Censorship, people yell censorship all the time now. But remember, that's when the state forbids certain kinds of expression. Having fact checkers, tweaking the algorithms, doing all these things, that's not censorship. Do something intelligent about that so we can have again a possible good public discourse around important facts and values that underlie political decision making.
Martin?
Look, I mean, one of the things that was sort of forgotten, perhaps, and you Adam mentioned this briefly just recently on the discussion on the role of free markets and globalization in the last 30, 40 years, and the belief that if you simply allow economic integration to continue, that eventually that will increase the threshold for military conflicts or other conflicts between states. We now know that is not completely true. But I think as far as our own societies go, I think we need to remember that although globalization was able to push income levels very much upwards in the last 30, 40 years, it was an uneven economic development. And the distribution of income in our societies has been allowed to become too unequal. And I think when you look at all these problems about disinformation and populism, there are very strong economic foundations of these frictions, because you trust authority if you believe in the person behind them. But if you lose that trust, you also lose the trust in the messages that you're receiving from these groups. And I think a lot of that trust has had to do with the social contract breaking down, that we have what I call a two-thirds society. Two-thirds of the population seeing increases in living standards and benefiting from globalization, one-third not benefiting. So that I think is a root problem of our democracies.
Adam?
I completely agree with both of you on those things. The two things I would add to it, one will seem to you terribly parochial and provincial, but in the American scheme of things, defeating Donald Trump is terribly important. Indicting him and holding him responsible for his crimes is important both to preserve American democracy and to reestablish the rule of law in the United States. The other thing that I'd emphasize, in addition to reducing economic inequality, if we could only go back to the United States of the 1950s, that supposedly terribly conservative period when the income distribution was much more, was not infinitely, but significantly more equal. The other thing is curing the democratic deficits, certainly that still plague the United States, but plague all of the liberal democracies, all of the ways in which the mechanics of our democracy fail to adequately reproduce the sentiments of its people. That's an extreme problem in the United States for lots of reasons, but it also affects my native country of Canada and affects many other places. And I think trying to simply to cure the democratic deficits that afflict us will necessarily play a role in renewing democracy.
Sten, you have the last word.
Oh, wow. Let's say something crazy. The first thing, which will cause reaction. I think that building a stronger defense today is very important to be able to defend democracy, making allies with other countries which are also democracies. The second thing sounds like a cliche, unfortunately, but the school is where you have to start. And I think that in both the United States and in Sweden, I'm very critical towards the school systems here and in the United States as well. And we think that we can solve problems with just telling young people that you should be Democrat. That is not how you reach the mind of a young person. To be Democrat, you understand what I'm saying. And you have to, besides just providing knowledge, you have to give something which is called Bildung, Bildning in Swedish, right? And that is where you can stop segregation from the start. And that can provide for a more a different type of just society where you can actually make these bridges across groups in society. And then you can have a different kind of unity for democracy and a liberal society, I think.
I couldn't agree more. If there was a single, if I were a non-democratic tyrant of the country, investing in early education is the single best thing we can do to solve democratic deficits, economic inequality, and all the rest. That's the single strongest piece of social capital we have is early public education.
Thank you very much. Åsa, Martin, Adam, and Sten.
Thank you.